Hi guys, hi, how's it going? How you doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I am going over the almost 60 palettes that I used last year in my palette roulette series, in which I review palettes that are in my collection, not necessarily the brandest new thing, but new to me, and I utilize them for a week and then I review them for you guys. I talk to you about the experiences I had with the palette, show you pictures, show you live swatches, and a lot of you really like that series on my channel, and I reviewed almost 60 palettes last year. So I have all of them, minus a couple that I've already decluttered, in front of me, and I thought I would rank them for you in terms of what was really poop and not worth your money and what was really awesome and something that I would recommend over and over again. And I think that you'll be surprised at where some of these fall, because I am surprised at where some of these fall. For those of you new here, hi, my name is Donna. I am a lover of all things high and colorful beauty and self-care. I also work in the beauty industry as a field leader for Ulta Beauty, and I get a lot of education in my position. I like to bring you that education here on my channel, but ultimately I'm just out here talking about makeup because I like to talk about makeup. And I'm certain that if you are here and watching my channel, you probably also like to talk about makeup. And I hope that you'll find that this channel brings solace to your soul in the way that it brings solace to mine, and that you'll want to subscribe before you go. And with that said, let's roll into this ranking of all the palettes that I utilized last year. I have all these palettes sitting in front of me and they're kind of precariously positioned. So I'm hoping that none of them fall over sometime between now and the end of this video. There are almost 60 palettes. There are 57 to be exact, and I was really actually surprised that I had reviewed that many palettes, number one, because I spent 6 whole weeks going through singles in my collection, but I also, did do a couple of weeks where I was doing more than one palette at a time. I think one week I even did 3 palettes at a time. 52 weeks in the year, I was really kind of surprised that I had 57 palettes. I also have in here the 2 palettes that I brought into my collection that I didn't necessarily do a palette roulette on, but I did like a get ready with me, utilizing the brand new things. I think those were 2 brand new Natasha Denona palettes. A lot to talk about, and I don't want these tumbling over. So there are, I think, 4 palettes on this list that I no longer have. I will stick a picture up here of what that palette is. Some of the items that I have in here I did declare, but I still have them. I'll let you know which those are. But coming in at number 57, dead last, is the Aether Beauty Moonlight Crystal palette. This was one of the only palettes that I did a palette roulette on that I actually in the video said the quality of this palette is shit. I hated that palette so much. The color story was beautiful. It looks like it's right up my alley as far as color story goes. In terms of what I love and what I don't love, this absolutely should have been a palette for me. I hated the formula of this palette. It was awful. There were 2 true mattes. There was definitely no opacity to them. They just kind of blended away into nothing. I really had wished that we had some better mattes in this palette, and the shimmers were not shimmery. They were more thick and satiny, and they created all kinds of, they exacerbated all the texture on my eyelids, and I just really hated it. This palette went to my daughter. She's very happily using it, but she's 11. So there's that. Number 56 in my collection would be this guy. This is the Cab Cosmetics Day Plus Night palette, and this was a palette that my mother brought to me that she got in a BoxyCharm. This was kind of Huda Beauty knockoff to one of, I think, the Rose Gold Remastered palette, or the Rose Gold palette, whether you have the first or the second version of that palette. Beautiful palette in theory. It just didn't have any opacity to it. It blended away to nothing. There wasn't a lot going for this palette, and it definitely wasn't going to take the place of its more expensive, like real version. Also, like, I can't say that I did a brand deep dive on this, and I can't say that I love the brand either. Like, what they stand for doesn't make any sense to me. I don't even know who those people are, to be honest with you. That one was decluttered already in my collection. I had to go pull it out of the declutter bin. The next one in here I also don't have. I gave it to my mother. It is number 55. It is the IBY Enlighten palette. This one wasn't necessarily a horrible palette. I did love the shimmers in it. It had some really nice neutral tones in it. It was more about the color story. The pastels in this palette I didn't feel like really set themselves apart from much else in the palette, and I did feel like it kind of blended away to nothing as well. It did have some really beautiful shades in it and some really beautiful shimmers in it though. I was gonna hold on to it for the shimmers and the shimmers alone, but like when I think about that palette and what it brought to my collection, there wasn't a whole lot in my collection that it could dupe and be better than. So I did end up decluttering that, and I gave it to my mom. Number 50. Oh my gosh, if I'm already losing count, there's going to be a problem. Number 54 was the Huda Beauty Purple Haze. Like, I'm not shocked that this shows up so low in this. And the thing about it is I really wanted to love this palette, and I really did think that it could bring something to the table had it been executed properly. It just isn't great. There's nothing fantastic about this palette. Three of the colors, these three colors right here, didn't even show up on my skin in the first place. This is the deepest color in here, and it was really kind of a just a meh purple. It wasn't a great purple. My favorite color in here was this one here, but I have that over and over and over again in my palette collection, and I just don't find that this was one of the better Huda Beauty Obsession palettes. Not that those are amazing palettes in the first place, because they're not. I've got better of those exact shades in my collection. The next one I have on here is the Urban Decay X Prints palette. So this is number 53. I'm not a huge fan of Urban Decay shadows to begin with, okay? I knew that this probably wasn't going to be one of my favorite palettes going into this, but I am a diehard Prince fan, and I wanted it for the pure nostalgia of it, and that's what it proved to be, is a piece of nostalgia from my collection. This is a beautiful palette, but it's really not all that fantastic. The blues really just kind of don't go with anything else, so you have to partner them together and together only. There wasn't a whole lot of variety in this palette. There wasn't a whole lot of depth in this palette, and I didn't 100% love it, but I do love it for the nostalgia piece of it, so it remains in my collection for that reason. It will probably honestly end up in my nostalgia drawer, because I can't see myself picking this up and wanting to use it ever again. It just wasn't a fantastic palette. I didn't have a lot of fun playing with it, and for that reason it ranked at number 53. Number 52 is another palette that I do not have. I gave it to my daughter. It's a beautiful palette. It just didn't work in the way that I needed it to, in the color story of it was a little scattered, if you ask me. It was the Estate Beauty Venice Fling palette, which was in collaboration with Bailey Sarian. I love Bailey. I love Bailey so much, and she used that palette on her eyes in one of her Murder Mystery Makeup Monday videos, and she came up with a beautiful eye look, and I also could come up with some beautiful eye looks in that palette, but it just didn't serve me in the way that I really wanted it to serve me, which is why I put it at the place that it is. I did give it to my daughter. It's a beautiful palette. It didn't have mattes in the right shades that I wanted it to have, and the shimmers that it had all led to a really dark, deep eye, and I just didn't feel comfortable using them on the crease space because they were just a little bit too shimmery. So that is why I put it in the place that I put it, and again, it's one that I don't have anymore because I did give it to my daughter Number 51 on my list was the ColourPop Garden Variety palette. This, I mean, it's a beautiful palette in theory. I love the packaging of it. And I really do love the shades of it. But the shimmers in this palette are phenomenal. But the rest of it, it's very one-noted. This is a magnetic palette, all of ColourPop is. So I will probably pop out some of these shimmers that are my favorite and then get rid of the rest because the mattes just don't do it for me. This is the deepest one in here. And then this one, which should be deep, is actually not all that spectacular. It was funny because when I was reviewing this, I was like, I just don't find myself pulling towards ColourPop shadows in the way that everybody else does, but I don't have very much ColourPop in my collection. I think this is one of 5 ColourPop palettes in my collection, and I know that makes me an anomaly out here in the beauty space, but I'm not part of their PR. Obviously, I'm not part of anybody's PR, but I'm definitely not reviewing them in the way that everybody else is. And what I can tell you is that I don't remember hearing anything about this palette when it did come out. I don't remember anybody reviewing it, and it's just very, very light. Number 50 was the Melt Stacks. These are awful. Like, I found that the Gunsmoke stack, right? Is that what this one is? Gunmetal stack was the one that I liked the most, but it is all shimmers except for this one matte, and it's very, very deep, very, very patchy, not super great to use, but the rest of the shadows in this Gunmetal stack were awesome. I liked them a lot. These guys, though, awful. These were awful shadows. This is the Lovesick stack. This is the shade Lovesick. Beautiful red, super, super patchy. This one was my favorite in this whole stack, and it is called Amelie, and it's like this duochromy, like goldy, peachy shade. Really pretty. Awful, awful blue. Awful, awful purple that I think is supposed to be a satin that is actually really, really chunky and awful. I don't know. I just did not get along with the Melt Stacks. I do like them for certain eye looks, like just tapping into certain places on an eye look, which is why I keep them in my collection. But these could very well get decluttered, and I would not probably miss 2 seconds of having them in my collection. The next one is number 49. This is the last one of the palettes on this list that I do not have in my collection. This is the Belt and Argent Plum Premonition palette, and I do believe I gave this to my sister-in-law. It suited her really well. It also is one of those palettes that I feel like should have been right up my alley, should have been a palette that I loved. Beautiful pinks and purples and kind of like mauve-y tones. But the glitters in this, or the shimmers in this palette, were straight up glitter, and I do not like glitter. So that took 2 of the 8 eyeshadows out of the realm of eyeshadows that I would dip into. And then the mattes in this palette were also not super amazing as far as like opacity and what I really like. They seem to blend away. They faded really quickly. So I just didn't love it. So I did declutter it, and I did give it to my sister-in-law. The next one I have is number 48. It is the KVD just Plum Quad. It's one of the Shade and Light Eye quads. This is from Kat Von D. I just had these in my backup drawer for whatever reason. This one was one of 2 that I used in the same video, and this one was by far the worst. All of the shades in this palette, besides this lilac right here, are really, really dark. Even this one right here, really translated on the eye as a really, really dark pink. And I just felt like this was super patchy. This one was too dark to be in the realm of kind of like a mid-tone, and it looked too much like this one on the eye. So really, ultimately, you had 3 different tones that you could use in this, and I just felt like it quantified a really dark eye look. So I didn't love using this palette. Very pigmented, very decent, I guess, to use, easy to use, I guess, because you're getting, you know, this quad of shadows that you don't really have to think much about, but you did with this one because it was all so dark and kind of melded into one another as if they were all the same shade. So I didn't really love this one, so that is why it shows up at number 48. Number 47, which I would argue might actually fall in the 48 spot, and these two could be reversed, but this is in this spot because I can't really use it on my face or my eyes. It didn't work either way. So this is the Fenty Beauty Kilowatt Foil Freestyle Highlighter Palette, and because it looks the way it did, I put it into my eyeshadows thinking that I could use it as an eye palette because there's definitely more shades in this that would be suitable for an eyeshadow than there is for a highlighter on my skin. However, on the eye, they crease so dang bad. And on the skin, they're just not great shades. This one I used as a blush and it looked like a bruise, even though when you like tap it into an eye look, it's actually not as opaque as it looks here in the pan. On the face, it looks like a bruise. It looks almost purple. And then this one was the only one that I could really use as a blush on my skin. This was a beautiful like blush topper, but like the blue, what are you gonna do with that blue besides put it on your eye? I really did like these two shades, but this one is too purple to wear on my skin because I am not into a purple highlight. This one is almost too icy. So that left this one and this one only that I could use on my face. And then as far as eyes go, they just creased so bad. So I did end up decluttering this at the end of the day because it wasn't one that I could use on my face and it wasn't one that I could use in my eyes as you know, determined by myself, not determined by anybody else. And that's where it will stay. But it was, I mean, if you enjoy those shades on your face as highlights, they really were beautiful highlights. But I'm not going to use them as highlights and I can't use them as eyeshadows because even though I have no problems with creasing, typically these creased all over the place. So number 46, 45, and 44 for me were these guys. Now, I'm not going to sit out here and tell you that the e.l.f. bite-size palettes are poop because I don't believe that they are. I put them in order of jalapeno being at number 46, truffle being at number 45, and cream and sugar being at number 44. They're not poop. They're just not the quality that I expect from an eyeshadow. To go from, you know, a Natasha Denona eyeshadow palette or a Melt eyeshadow palette or even a Glamlight eyeshadow palette down to a $3 e.l.f. eyeshadow palette and expect the same quality is ridiculous, right? But I wasn't expecting the same quality and they're good for what they are. They're just not better than anything else in my collection and nothing that I would find myself pulling for instead of the other things in my collection, even if I were traveling. These are good sized travel palettes, but I just don't see these being better than like a Natasha Denona 5-pan that I might pull into my makeup bag for a travel reason. I do have one other one that did rank a little bit higher in the ranking because I enjoyed it a little bit more, but it's still not going to be one that I pull for outside of the realm of all the other palettes in my collections. Number 43 is the Glamlight Paint Pro palette. This is the palette of the two that I really thought I was gonna like more. It's just got that really beautiful, like almost vivid fluorescent colors to it. Definitely more up my alley than I think a just a primary eyeshadow palette is, but this one performed a lot more weak than the regular paint palette did, which is why I put it here. This white shade here, I almost dug to the bottom of every single time I used it. It's kind of like a Super Shock, but maybe a little bit more creamy. These are all of the shimmers and none of them really perform super great on a brush. You do have to use your fingers, and if you know anything about me, you know I don't like dipping my fingers into makeup. I will if I have to, but that kind of put this palette on the back burner for me. It's not one that I think that I'll pull for very often. I will probably keep it in my collection because it is pretty, and I do foresee myself probably using it, but it's just not, when I think of rainbow palettes, it's not the first one that comes to mind for me. The next one is the number 42 palette, and that is the Tarte Man-Eater. I know that a lot of my, peers out here on the YouTube space promoted this as the number one Tarte palette on the planet, and I don't know that I feel that. This is a palette that I felt like disappointed in myself for buying. I love Tarte. I love Tarte's performance. I love their mattes are pretty standard. Some of the best mattes out there. Really, really blendable, really easy to use. This, and no fallout for the most part. This fell out all over my face. I had a really hard time using it. I had a really hard time getting different looks out of it. Like, I feel like it's all very one-noted. There's not a whole lot of variety. Even though there's so many different shades in here, there's not a whole lot of variety. It also didn't make sense to me why there was two different formulas of shimmer in here, but those two different formulas of shimmer all were like mishmashed together. And there are like leopard printing on some of the shades, which would have made sense to put one kind of shimmer formula under the leopard printing and one kind under the non-leopard printing, but they didn't do that. I don't know. This palette just, it wasn't it for me. Yes, it's a beautiful fall tone palette, but I didn't think that it was the best Tarte palette out there. Maybe I got a dud, who knows? But I just don't think it's all that it's cracked up to be. This is the Morphe Desert Bouquet palette, and this one, I actually really liked this palette. Granted, there's two solid rows in this palette that I didn't get a whole lot of use out of. They are a lot of, from the pastel range that I don't really pull a lot of pastels into my collection, nor do I put a whole lot of pastels on my face. They're just not my favorite thing to work with. This palette, however, is so beautiful. There's a lot of depth in here. This green section down here I had a lot of fun with. I had a lot of fun with these darker tones here. Overall, I really did have a lot of fun with this palette, and that is why it ranks in the place that it does, and why I will probably keep it, even though I am a firm Morphe not liker. So there's that. The next one I have on here is really, really strange and really, really sad to me, but it is the Huda Rose Quartz. I did not love this as much as I thought I was going to love it, and Huda doesn't typically pull me in with anything other than the Obsession palettes. I don't typically 100% go for her larger, like, palettes that come out once a year, which for whatever reason is what it is. I have a lot of them. I don't typically get sucked in by Huda. This one sucked me in, and I don't know why this one sucked me in, because it's just kind of a basic palette. I did not love this palette. I have a love, an affinity for a couple of the shades in this palette, but other than that, the rest of it could just probably go in the garbage. I did not love the eye looks that I got from this. They just weren't impactful, and also really, really pink, even though this looks like it should have like some depth to it here. There should be some depth to it here. It was very, very muted, and I think that's why I didn't like it. I think I felt like I got a whole lot of pastel, again, from that palette, more so pastel from that palette than I got from like Mercury Retrograde, and that would be more of a pastel palette in my humble opinion. I felt like the performance of this ranked right up there with her Obsession palettes, and her Obsession palettes are by far the poopier version of her palettes. So now we're getting into the middle third, right? And in the middle third, I first have the Charlotte Tilbury Quad at number 39. This is the Charlotte Tilbury Walk of No Shame Quad, and I just didn't love this. I just think that Charlotte Tilbury shadows are a little more overrated than they perform, or than they should be due to performance. I think that there's no matte to speak of in this palette. There should be some depth with the colors that show up on this side, and there just wasn't. It just gave me one eye look, which is fine. It's a quad, you're only gonna get a certain amount of variety from a quad. But I didn't even enjoy the one eye look that I could get from this, because even though these two shades right here look very, very different, they show up very similarly on the eye look. So you're just not getting a lot. I just didn't have a lot of fun with this palette, and who knows, maybe I would like one of her bigger palettes. This came in ahead of the Charlotte Tilbury quad at number 38 in the ranking, and it is an e.l.f. bite size that costs $3. It is the Rosewater quad. Such a beautiful quad. The one thing that it does not have going for it is this matte over here is a glitter matte. I hate glitter mattes, but at least it's a beautiful matte, and it doesn't, like, the glitter within it doesn't really cannibalize on its ability to blend. So we've got two mattes in here and two shimmers in here, and I feel like it does a really good job of creating different eye looks. I could get a solid 2 or 3 different eye looks out of this quad and be really confident in my eye look with this quad. At number 37, I have the ABH Rose Quartz palette. I think this one could have ranked up higher. It's got a nice, like, grungy feel to it, but it also looks very industrial and almost dirty. So that is why I put it here. It is pretty. It's got a really great formula, but I did not love the way that any of these shadows looked on my eyes. I didn't love just the tonality, the undertones of it. Number 36, I have the Persona Identity 2. I didn't really enjoy playing with this palette. It could have probably went lower on the totem pole, but I do think that there were the other palettes that are, you know, further on in the ranking deserve to be in those lower spots. This one, the shimmers for the most part in this are more satins than they are shimmers. They kind of disappear from my eye looks, and they are very, very dark and blend away to like a gray base, and I did not love that. I also did not love that the mattes that you have in here, this one, this one, this one, and this one, were all very basic, and they didn't really lean into that whole jewel tone vibe that you've got going on with the shimmers in this palette. So I didn't love this palette. I didn't have a fun time playing with it. It does go really, really deep to really, really light, but I didn't feel like the mattes really helped through the experience of using that palette, which is why it landed there. Number 35 is the Huda Beauty Wild Obsessions Python palette. I did have a really great time with this palette. Through the realms of all the rest that I've got to go through, I really don't feel like this is the best of the best, right? This brown is a wonderful brown. All of these mattes in here were actually really great mattes and went with this palette in a great way. This was like a shocker, like duochrome shade that was crazy sauce, but it is just not an amazing palette. The blue I really wanted to be like a wonderful like tealy green shimmer, and it's more of a topper. These two are really packed full of glitter, and I didn't love that. It's also just a color story that doesn't like help itself out. So that is ranking in at number 35, and at number 34 I have the Natasha Denona pastel palette. So we all knew that when I purchased this, because I said I probably wasn't gonna put this at the top, tippity top of my, you know, love for Natasha Denona list. This is a beautiful pastel palette, but it's not like pastels on crack. I've had better pastels. These are definitely very white based. They definitely need some other color to go with it. Very one noted, very, not one noted, I guess, but very light. There isn't any depth in this palette whatsoever, and that is hard for somebody who needs some depth. Even this dark purple is not a very deep purple because it's a creamed powder, and it shows up on the skin as a very lilac-y purple instead of a deep purple. I wish there had been just a little bit more depth in this palette than there is. It is beautiful. I really enjoyed playing with it. This yellow was one of my favorites, but it got hard pan really easy. I found that to be true in a lot of the shades in this palette, and I don't know if it's because it's, you know, a white based pastel palette or what it is, but because of all those things, this does come in that at that like middle of the road place in the palette ranking. Number 33 is the Nomad Cartagena Mágica. Try to say that right. Palette, and this one came in the same spot, mostly because it was super fun to play with this, but again, no depth. I had to bring in some other palettes when I was working with this one just to give it a little bit of that outer V depth that we like to have in our eye looks, because this is definitely an orange palette, but it's very one shade of orange palette. I loved working with the shadows all together. I got some beautiful eye looks out of this palette, but it's very mid-toned or light-toned. There's no depth and no variety in that palette for nothing. All right, number 32 for me is going to be the Flower Beauty Jungle Lights palette. This palette is here simply because of how stunning and beautiful the shimmers are in here. I had a whole lot of fun with this palette. The shimmers are beautiful. It is super fragile though, and you know, because it's a shimmer only palette, I have it, and it's not like everyday shimmers. I have it as far down on the list as it is. I had a lot of fun playing with it, but my favorite is probably this one right here. It is stunning. So pretty. But I just don't think that this is, you know, a palette that I can pull for them all the time, so it has to land a little bit lower on the list. I felt like it exacerbated texture a little bit too, so that's what put it as low on the list as it is. The next one I have on here is the other Shade and Light Eye Quad by Kat Von D, and this one is in Rust. I had a lot more fun with this palette. I saw a lot more variety with this palette, and I could pull a couple of different eye looks with this palette. I also really love oranges on my eyes, so that might be why this lands here. I felt like this was a really light tone peach and really nice for you know, setting an eyelid, and this one was far enough away from that that it actually highlighted. And then these two center shades were different, whereas with the plum one, I felt like the two center shades were too similar to each other, especially once on the eye, to look different. So that's why that one ranked so far down in the ranking, and this one's ranking at number 31. At number 30, I have the Colored Rain Vivid Pigments palette. Now this guy, I would say, could rank as one of my favorite-ish rainbow palettes, but these are really difficult to use. I found that they, if you didn't go in like so slowly, they definitely voided. They definitely got muddy if you were working against the color wheel. And I like pigment. I just don't like difficult pigment, if that makes any sense. Like, I felt like I could get, I had a much better time with other rainbow palettes in my collection. I also have a lot of hard pan on this green, which is weird to me, but it was a really difficult shadow to even pick up on a brush because it just kept getting hard pan. This isn't necessarily a palette in my collection that I don't love. I do love it. I just had, love is a big word. I do like it. I just have better rainbow palettes in my humble opinion, and Colored Rain has done leaps and bounds better things with their formula than what they had in terms of when they came out with this palette. So I just have better colorful shadows that I worked with this year. So that one did rank there. And then at number 29, we have the Flower Desert Lights palette. Now this one, like I said, is only ranking a little bit further down the list than the Jungle Lights palette because it has everyday shimmer shades in it. It doesn't have like the green and the purple, like you could wear this every single day. But again, these exacerbate texture like no man's business. So you have to be really light-handed. They're really super thick. So you have to finesse those shadows just so, which is why both of them ended up in the, 29 through 35 range. The next palette I have on the list is number 28, and it is the Too Faced Razzle Dazzle palette. I was actually pretty surprised by this palette, to be honest. Too Faced is not my favorite brand. I don't 100% love their formula, but I had a really good time with this palette. I absolutely loved working with it. I think that the mattes in this palette worked really good with the shimmers in this palette. And this one was the only one that I didn't 100% love using. And because it's such a, small, 7-pound eyeshadow palette, and there was one of them that I hated using in it, that's why it ranks as low as it did. But I really did have a good time with this palette and loved every eye look I got from it. And it smells like raspberries, and I love that. So that is where that one is. Number 27 is the Natasha Denona Peak palette. And I think that the only reason why I rank this one here is because the Peak and the Ayana palette that came in BoxyCharm were all made up of already existing shades in the Natasha Denona Roundup, and I have every single one of these shades in the palettes that I own by Natasha Denona. I think there might be one in here that I don't have. I do like this palette. It was easy to use. I love that it had four mattes and one shimmer, but I would say that I could have even went with 3 mattes and 2 shimmers, and that would have been more pleasing. I think that's why this comes in where it comes in. There just wasn't, again, it's a 5-pan eyeshadow palette, and I know that if I take this on the road with me, I'm going to get some really great eye looks out of it, but there wasn't enough variety here for me to rank this any higher than what I have ranked. The next one I have is the Ace Beauté Blossom palette. Now this is one of their old formula palettes, and the only reason why I have this ranked as low as I do, I mean, number 26 is nothing to scoff at in terms of almost 60 eyeshadows, but it's because this formula was just a little bit harder to mess with than the other Ace Beauté palettes that I have, and I felt like they weren't showing up as true to pan as what the other palettes that I have in this whole like Paradise collection have. I loved the eye looks that I got out of this palette. I really did have a great time with this palette. But there's only, 3 shimmers in this palette, this one, and this one, and they're not all that great. And the mattes in this palette are kind of, I don't know, hard to get to show up in the way that you want them to show up. I had a really good time with this palette, and I loved every eye look that I got out of this palette, which is why it ranks as high as it does. But it just wasn't my favorite of the Ace Beauté palettes that I have in my collection. The next one I have is the Tarte Make Believe in Yourself palette. This is a palette that's been in my collection for a long, long time. And this was a palette that I had used intermittently at some point between owning it and doing a palette roulette on it, but I actually physically got to use every single shadow in this palette and got real familiar with it over the palette roulette time frame that I spent with it, and I really love this palette. However, it has been in my collection for quite some time, so this landed on my plan to pan for 2023. I do plan on introducing this in January as a project pan item and just utilizing the poop out of it until I finish it up. It is almost entirely shimmers, and that's just not where my brain goes. I really like a good matte. This only has one matte right here. And then this face powder is actually pretty poopy for a face powder. It's packed full of glitter. It's really super chunky. It's just not what I love for face powder. So I am going to try and get this out of my collection in 2023. But I did find that I loved the shimmers in this palette so dang much. They were super smooth, didn't exacerbate texture at all. Felt really good to put on, felt really good coming off. There wasn't like all kinds of scratchiness or, you know, chunkiness from glitters or whatnot. So I really did like that palette. The next one on my list is the number 24 Natasha Denona Retro Glam. So I utilized this in a Get Ready With Me when I first brought this into my collection. And I think that you will see in that video that this palette just really wasn't everything that my brain told me it was going to be. This deep green is not deep at all. This brown is not deep at all. It's very light with no depth whatsoever. And I know I keep saying that about several of these palettes, but that's really what ranks a palette for me, is if I have something that goes really, really light to really, really deep all in one palette, and I can pull everything I need from this one palette, and I can't with this one. I love the packaging of this. It is so cool and definitely not Natasha Denona in a nutshell. This is very different from her regular stuff. And I do love the color story of it. I just wish it had a little bit more punchy mattes. I wish it had a little bit more deep mattes. The darker colors in here are all the creamed powder formula, and those perform a little bit lighter than what they actually appear in a pan, which is different from her mattes, which actually appear a lot darker than what they are in the pan on your eye. I need more depth from a palette, and it's okay. I love Natasha Denona for the most part. That one is a palette that I like. It's just not one that I see myself pulling for all the time. The next one on the list, number 23, is the Glamlite paint palette. So the Paint Pro was way further along in the list because I just didn't feel like it performed as well as this one does, even though I loved its colors a little bit more than I love the colors in this one. All of these perform really well. What I would say is the reason why it ranks as low as it does is this one and these two could be one shade, and this one with these two could be one shade, because they all look the exact same on an eye look as the next in that same group. I loved that this one had a black matte in it. I love that it had a really nice shimmery white that was a straight up white with kind of like a gold shift to it. I love that the blues were very different blues, and I loved working with all the shimmers in this palette. They performed quite nicely on the eye. I just liked this one a lot more than I liked the other paint palette. It performed a lot better than the other paint palette did. The next one I have is the Space Case Quad that I have here. Really nice shimmers in this palette. I feel like you got a good amount of variety in this palette. Again, it's all shimmers, so it's not going to come in at number one if it's all shimmers in my collection. I love that you had a really light, you know, shimmer in this and a really deep shimmer in this, that you could get an all over lid look out of this, but you could also just use it for those pops of shimmer that you need in the inner corner or the brow bone. But it's, I mean, it's a better shimmer in my humble opinion than these guys because it doesn't exacerbate texture, but not as impactful as those guys for sure. That's why they all kind of come in the same spot. The next one I have is number 21, and it is the Natasha Denona Ayana palette. I loved this palette, but again, it is a palette that's made up of other shades out of the Natasha Denona palette structure, which is why it comes in where it does. I do believe I have 3 of the 5 shades that are in this palette, and I mean, I don't think I would have partnered the colors that are in this palette together, to be honest. I loved working with it. I love the kind of camouflagey, grungy tone that's in this palette, which is why it's ranked where it's at. but it didn't rank higher because I have all the shadows in this palette in other palettes in my Natasha Denona collection. So really love that one. Would take it out on the road with me. It would be something that I know I could get like multiple eye looks out of, even if it is only 5 pans of shadow. And this one does have 2 shimmers and 3 mattes out of it, which I think is probably the pretty perfect ratio for a 5-pan palette. The next one I have on here, number 20. So down to the last 20. And so really every palette from about 30 below, I really like, I really enjoy. But these ones are like the cream of the crop, I guess. Number 20 would be the Reina Ribalde Oaxaca palette, right? This was the surprise of the century because this is a palette that my aunt got me at Walmart during Halloween, and this is what it looks like. And when I put it into my palette roulette to use, I was straight up, this is gonna suck. It didn't suck. Like this blue is probably the best navy blue I have in my collection. This periwinkle's beautiful, beautiful lilac-y periwinkle in this like cornflower blue. I was shocked at how well these blues performed. And this highlight shade here is actually quite beautiful. Very kind of cool toned, but really quite beautiful on the skin. I really loved it. I loved working with it. And because all 3 of those blues are very different blues, it actually lent a lot of variety to an eye look, even though there's only 4 shades in it. So I was really kind of surprised by that one, but that's where we're at. Number 19, I have the Wayne Goss Luxury Eye Palette in Imperial Topaz. You know, here's the thing. I would say that this could probably come in at number 25, number 29, maybe even less than that, because it is so boring, and because there's this one shade in here that I refuse to use because it's all glitter. But these powders blend themselves. Like, I'm not even joking. The powders in this palette, like, shocked the hell out of me, because it was like, put it on my eye, boop, 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 done. It's blended and beautifully blended and looked gorgeous. And would I purchase another Wayne Goss palette? Yes, absolutely, because of the formula in this one. However, I hate this one here. His shimmers are not it. So if I do purchase another Wayne Goss palette, it would be one that doesn't have any shimmers in it, because I hate that one. So this one and the Tarte Make Believe in Yourself were the only 2 palettes in my palette roulette series that I used this year that I had used previously. But this one I had only had a handful of uses out of before putting it into the palette roulette series, and I'm kind of ashamed to say that, because this has been out for like ever and is, as far as I can tell, no longer available on the Lorac website, because it is that dang old. This is the Lorac Pro. I did put this at number 18. The pigmentation in this is absolutely phenomenal. The blendability in this is absolutely phenomenal. The shimmers in here, they leave your heart desiring just a little bit more. I think that they're beautiful satins. I do not think that they're shimmers. Again, this isn't even available anymore, and I think a lot of the reason is because they've changed how they operate their formula. They've changed how they operate, you know, their palettes these days. So I do want to try a more updated version of the Lorac eyeshadows, but I will need to find a palette that calls to me as much as that one did when I purchased it. But I'm happy to have that in my collection. The number 17 palette is the Marc Jacobs Electric palette, and I think that the only reason why it's here is because it's just a little tiny 7-pan eyeshadow palette. But The Marc Jacobs formula is really a dang decent formula. I'm really sad that you can't purchase Marc Jacobs Beauty anymore, because this really is a great formula. There are 4 mattes in here, 3 shimmers, and it was a beautiful palette to play with. I played with it around this time last year, at the beginning of the year, because it was, if I remember correctly, it was my New Year's Eve palette, and then reviewed it the following week. Loved it. It was really beautiful. Blended like a dream. I would say between that and Wayne Goss, they've got pretty similar formulas. The Wayne Goss one, I think the formula is better, but I loved the Marc Jacobs color story better, which is why they're, you know, one ranks a little bit higher than the other. I would repurchase them, but you can't anymore, so there's that. Number 16 is the Au Maquillage Color Boss Quad in Make Moves, and it is just a purple pinky quad that is so easy and beautiful. This was one of those things that was kind of odd to me, was that I loved a quad as much as I loved this quad. It was so pretty and went from really, really deep to really, really light, and I had a really good time with this. And as little shadow is you know, variety is what's in here, it actually was, it had a really nice pretty variety to it. This one leans a little bit more brown, this leans a little bit more pink, and then you have your purple and your white. There was actually a lot more variety in this quad than I had anticipated there being, so I had a really good time with that quad. ColourPop Baroque palette. So this was also one of the first ones that I used in the new year, and this held my heart for grays, what I thought I needed to have in a gray, and kind of gave me that badass bee kind of mindset when I wore it. I loved this eyeshadow palette so much more than I ever thought I was going to, or absolutely could love a gray eyeshadow palette. This is such a beautiful, beautiful eyeshadow palette. I'm super excited to have it in my collection, and I'm super excited to have this healthy reminder that it exists in my collection, because, you know, you kind of forget sometimes. The next one is number 14, and that would be the Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3 Experience Palette. And the only reason why this comes in the spot that it comes in is because it's all shimmers, it's all multi-chromes, and it can't be a one and only eyeshadow palette. But my god, this is beautiful. It is so, so pretty. And as I said in the palette roulette, I think the best of the best that you're going to get as far as mainstream multi-chromes go. I think that, am I blinding you with it? I think that it is so beautiful, and I love that it's got the 2 creams in here that you can, you know, pack onto the lid and then put any one of these powders on top of it, and it's going to create a completely different color process than what you had originally thought was going to happen with these multi-chromes. But I don't know if you guys can see just how multi-chromatic they are. They're so, so pretty. Number 13 is going to be the Natasha Denona Purple Blue. Now, the only reason why this is number 14 is because I didn't have as much fun with this one as I thought I was going to, because of all the beautiful purples and blues in here. The matte formula in these larger 28-pound palettes for her are a different matte formula than what she currently uses, and I found that I had to build them a lot more to get the opacity that I wanted from them, and that's neither good, bad, nor indifferent. That's just a different formula than what I'm used to for Natasha Denona. I really thought that when I went in with this like turquoise, it was going to be that turquoise on my eye, and it just wasn't, which is why I have this ranked where I do. I think if this wasn't such bright, brilliant turquoise and such lavender purples, and, you know, if it wasn't to that extent, I probably would have ranked it a lot higher, because the green brown is a lot higher. But the purple blue is my least favorite of the 2 large 28 pans, so that's why it ranked in there. The next one I have, number 12, is going to be the Sydney Grace Mel Thompson collab. Now, I loved this palette, and the first time I used it was this year, even though this came out, I believe, last year. Really great color story, even though it's kind of a little bit all over the place. This row right here, these three shades here, really go deep and get any one of the shadows that you have in here really deep. The only one that I didn't get along with was this one here, and this is the only one that is not new to the palette. All the other shades are new shades. This one already existed in Sydney Grace shadows. So like Mel did a really good job with this. I'm really sad that, you know, Mel is no longer with us, but really happy to have a piece of Mel, and really happy that it's one of my favorite palettes of 2022, because it could have been not a great palette and I would have felt really awful talking about it, but it is really a great palette. Mel is just, you know, was an amazing entity here in the space, and Sydney Grace is an amazing formula of single eyeshadows. So at number 11 is going to be the Ace Beauté Nostalgia palette. It was a fun time. I really enjoyed playing with it. I love that it goes really, really light and really, really deep. I love the vibrant, like, jewel tones in this. I love that it's mostly matte. There's very few shimmers in here, and when you're dabbling with these kind of colors, you really want them to be great matte formulas, or at least according to me, you do. But also the shimmers in here were very vibrant and beautiful. You have this one, and this one, and that is it. I'm okay with that. I like, if I'm gonna have a something heavy eyeshadow palette, I would rather it be a matte. But also I think I have it so low on the list because it doesn't have more shimmers in it, and I had wished it had. So I think it would partner perfectly with something like this though, in the future. The next one I have shocked me. Again, it's a shocker. It is number 10. And it is the Too Faced Natural Nudes palette. Tell me why I have a basic B eyeshadow palette in the top 10. You will be surprised. If you are familiar with the eyeshadow palettes that I used over the last year, you'll be surprised, or you shouldn't be surprised, but you probably will be surprised at what I have in my top 10 lineup. Too Faced Natural Nudes probably a turnaround point for me. Like, I am almost driven to try some more defined, more recent Too Faced formulas, because I tried this and loved it so much. And you know, because it's neutrals, it sat in my collection for almost a year before I used it, which is, I'm embarrassed to say, but it did. The next one I have is the Natasha Denona My Dream palette. So this is number 9, and I love this palette. Please do not get the number 9 mixed up in your head. I love this palette. I had a lot of fun with this palette. It's got a nice like dual chrome here. It's got kind of a dual chrominess up here as well. It is a beautiful eyeshadow palette. The reason why it's number 9 and not like number 1 is because I do find that this is just kind of basic, right? It's kind of a basic palette. Again, it is a basic palette in my top 10. What the hell is going on with me? I love though that it's got the purples in here, that it's got the black in here, and it is beautiful. I just find that it's a little more, I mean, if you have a ton of Natasha Denona in your collection, you don't need this. You have this over and over and over again. I was really actually surprised that she came out with such a typical palette for her dream collection, but I love that palette. Number 8 is the ABH Nouveau palette. You guys, this is so pretty. I had such a good time with this palette, and as green as I thought it was going to be, it's not really. I feel like I love it. I wish there were 2 more eyeshadows in it though. I would rather have the same size normal ABH pans and 2 more eyeshadows than the bigger pans and 2 less, specifically because it costs more. The one that I don't think belongs in here and we don't really need it is this one, but I do think that that is a beautiful shadow, and I loved using it on an inner corner. Even the golds in here I had a really good time with. So this did come in at number 8. I don't know what it is about it that I liked so much. Besides the fact that it was really easy to use and it was a wonderful, like, up-leveled ABH formula. I don't know, but I didn't really like the rose metals one, so go figure. Number 7 for me is the Natasha Denona Xenon palette. Again, I tried that Baroque, really fell in love with grays. This one kind of kicked those Baroque grays in the butt, if I do say so myself. It was a wonderful, wonderful palette to work with. And with this one, you got 4 mattes and 1 shimmer, and I thought that that was a really great mix for this. Got really, really deep, really, really light. I could get quite a few eye looks out of this, and they were beautiful grays and a wonderful black. Like, that black is beautiful. Beautiful little double duty black. It doesn't swatch well, but man, it packs a punch. This was a wonderful palette to use. I would use this as my party going palette every single time. Number 6 would be the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 2 eyeshadow palette. I loved this. This is so much fun. You have 2 creams over here, which really perform very well on their own, but also create a really nice base. All these beautiful rosy tones. And then these shimmers are crazy sauce. The one thing that knocks this out of the ranking for me is that these 2 shimmers, or yeah, these 2 mattes right here, could be the same shade in an eye look. I just didn't feel like you had all the variety that you needed in this palette. You could have gone a little bit lighter than this and a little bit deeper than this and still had the same thought process, maybe even a little bit pinker. But I loved this palette. I loved playing with it. It's like a perfect like blends like no other formula. I love Patrick Ta as in a nutshell, you know, as a brand in a nutshell, but I really had a good time with this eyeshadow palette. However, I had more fun, I feel like, with the NARS Summer Unrated, which is why it comes in a little bit ahead of the Patrick Ta. I felt like there was a lot more variety in this palette, and it was the first time I had ever tried a NARS eyeshadow and was really kicking myself in the ass for having waited so long to try a NARS eyeshadow. And every single one of their eyeshadow palettes is like a limited edition. It never sticks around and it never comes back. This was so pretty. I had a lot of fun with this palette, and it was just that perfect like bronzy goldy rosiness. A lot of shimmers in this palette though. A lot of shimmers. I would have preferred a little more matte. My number 4 palette was the total opposite of that. Same kind of color story, but had a few more mattes than it did shimmers, and that would be the Gemini 2 palette by Milk Cosmetics. This ranks really high for me because I love Milk Cosmetics as a brand. I would say that they're probably in my top 5 brands. But this was the first time I had really tried one of their palettes and not struggled from shade to shade to shade. They do have a little bit of an inconsistent formula, and everybody will tell you that. But this was straight up perfection every single time I used it, and I loved every single eye look I got out of it. And I love that it has like all these like peachy rosy tones straight into rosy tones and then into grunge. And that was perfection in my book. I love that it only had 2 shimmers in it, but I do wish that the 2 shimmers that it had were different than the 2 shimmers that exist in here. You have this green here and this like rusty tone here. I wish we had had just one more shimmer, or made this one just a regular shade and had that one other shimmer be a little bit lighter in tone, because all your eye looks out of this were really dark. But oh my god, so pretty. And I love I still keep it in its thingy-majigger. Number 3 for me is Natasha Denona Biba. Are you guys seeing a pattern here? Like, what is with all the neutrals with me? I mean, even today I have a neutral eye look on. This was probably, I mean, I went back and forth with whether this was going to be number one for the year or no. I love this palette. I love that you have like a orangey tone and then a red like warm tone and then a cool tone row. In this, it's just a little bit of everything. It's not like saturated with shimmers, it's not saturated with mattes. It's the 50-50 split. It's such a wonderful basic palette from Natasha, and so beautiful. I am super happy to have this in my collection, and it comes in at number 3 for me. Number 2 would be the part of me that loves greens. It is the Melt Gemini palette. Listen, I love green so much. It is my favorite color, and this palette was one of my favorites to mess with this year. I did have these two palettes in a palette roulette together, and I was so excited that I had done that because I got my rosy tones, I got my mustard tones, I got all of the green I could ever want between this one and the other one. Such a beautiful palette. I, again, just feel like this was a melt formula that was consistent the whole way through. It was amazing. It was so much fun to work with. I loved every eye look I got from it. This green right here, such a beautiful, like, pukey army green. It went very grunge for me. It had the shimmers that it had were the perfect shimmers. You had a green shimmer, you had a light orange shimmer, perfect shimmers for me. It was just an amazing palette to play with. I had a lot of fun with it, and it was my number 2 palette and my number 1 palette of the year. If you had not already guessed it, is the Natasha Denona Green Brown. So here we are again in neutral territory. My number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 palette could very much be everybody's basic B palette. And what the hell happened to me? Because all of my colorful palettes landed at the other end of the spectrum. But man, this could be my one and done eyeshadow palette. This could be the only palette that I have in my collection, and I would probably be perfectly fine. It's got the perfect amount of shimmers, the perfect amount of mattes. The only thing that I don't love about this palette, that I love about all of Natasha Denona's other palettes, is, as I said, with the purple blue, the mattes in this are a completely different formula from her creamy matte formula that she now has in existence. So they are a little less opaque. You do have to build them up a little bit more. That's not a bad thing. That can be a good thing, especially for people like me who like to go in ham with the pigmentation first and foremost and then try and fix it later. I didn't find that problem to occur with this palette because I did have to build up the mattes, but man, I love this palette so much. This is a $250 palette, $238 I think is what it is. I got mine and the purple blue on a killer deal because I got them number 1 as a bundle, and then number 2, so they were discounted because they were a bundle, but then I also got them on an additional discount because I had some code or something, I can't remember. I ended up getting both palettes for the price of what you would pay for one, so I'm really excited to have both of them in my collection, but this would be my number 1 palette for this year. Whew! We made it. We did it, you guys. 57 palettes we just went through. I used 57 different palettes for the first time this year. Besides, 2 of them, which I had used, occasionally here and there before, but the Lorac and the Tarte Make Believe in Yourself, we're not going to count those. The rest of them, first time I had ever used them was this year, and I'm glad I got to rank them with you. Let me know how you feel about my rankings. Let me know what your thoughts are. I would be so interested to hear if you would do it differently. If you've tried all of these, where do you think that they land? Thank you guys so much for watching today. I appreciate every single one of you for being here today. I hope that your holidays were amazing, that your new year is going super swell, and that you are safe and healthy and getting along as best you can in this crazy world we are living in, and that you are all loving each other but loving each other from afar. Again, thank you guys for being here today. I appreciate you so much. And until next time, bye friends.